This is Author Talk, brought to you by Authorhouse, the leading provider of services to help authors publish, promote, and sell their books. Author Talk is produced by TogiNet Radio, on the web at toginet.com.
The title of the book, The Jewish People and Jesus. Is it time for reconciliation? You decide. And the authors are Joseph Butta and Stephen Daskal. And Joseph joins us now on Author Talk. Hello, Joseph.
Hi, sir. How you doing?
Well, I'm doing great, and this looks like a very, let's say, soul-searching kind of book, would you say?
Well, I'd say so. I wanted to write a book that really made people think.
There you go. Well, let me read a little bit what you have written just to set the stage. You say this: what I have done in this work is to take the Jewish point of view, as stated in David Klinghoffer's book, Why the Jews Rejected Jesus, and restated these ancient arguments against reconciliation. I argue for reconciliation, then leave the reader to decide. So you're going to give all the facts and let the reader make his own mind up.
That's correct. That was absolutely the intention. Because sometimes you read certain kind of books and they're all from one particular point of view, and if someone from a different point of view sees that, they're quite much more easily to dismiss that. But if part of that book, or almost half of that book, may contain the point of view that you're familiar with, you may be more prone to, hey, read a little more. Then the other point of view may become more palatable to you because your present point of view is also represented.
So you grew up a Catholic.
That's correct.
And here you are trying to help the Jews understand their heritage of really who they are?
Well, what happened really with me in a lot of conversations with some Jewish people, and I noticed is that many times when they would speak, they weren't speaking from what the Jews call the Tanakh, which we would call the Old Testament. They would continually refer to the Talmud. So this got me curious in terms of what weight do the Jewish people, especially the more religious Orthodox, put on the Talmud vis-a-vis the Old Testament? Because I already knew that the New Testament was rejected. So the question then became, where does the Talmud stand vis-a-vis the Old Testament? And this is what really, as I started to dig in more, this really gave me a lot of more inspiration for writing the book.
So you want to help Christians, and, well, let's start with the Christians. You want to help Christians be aware that of centuries of Christian anti-Semitic feelings really helped form this wedge between Christians and Jews.
Yeah, and it really, a lot of folks, they just see, well, the Jewish people reject Jesus. But when I started really investigating and going back through 2,000 years, really up to going close to about to 1,000 years after the Christian era really started, and really before that, the institutional anti-Semitism within the Christians of Europe became a problem. And I started to wonder, well, if the New Testament is talking about the Jews and being God's chosen people and the apple of his eye, why were these Christians who are supposed to be getting their inspiration from the New Testament, knowing that Jesus and his followers were all Jewish, why did they have this feeling towards the Jewish people? And what I really found out is that for the first 300 and so years after Jesus and the apostles, anybody in the world that who wanted to come to faith in the Messiah, faith in Jesus, had to convert. There was no established church per se. The Christians at that time were persecuted by the Romans, and some of the persecutions were very bloody. So people at that time to come in faith in Jesus had to sometimes put their life on the line or decide this is the truth. And how did they come to that faith? They were reasoned into it. People were telling them about it, and they made decisions to leave the paganism that they believed in, whether Greek or its variant, the Roman style, or some other kind of belief. But after the time of Constantine, when, what happened is that when the emperor started to say, okay, you know what, we're not going to persecute the Christians. Matter of fact, we're going to make it part of the empire itself. Well, in very short order, a lot of people who were pagans, instead of going through this conversion process, which the first 300 years of the folks did, both Jew and Gentile, into faith in Jesus, all of a sudden, when the emperor said it was okay, a Jupiter worshiper yesterday says, well, I guess I'm a Christian tomorrow. And what happened is that conversion never happened. So the same attitudes that those folks had, whether they were anti-Jewish or whatever they were, then were with the folks because they just took on a new title. So when the church became institutionalized, then what happened is, how do you bring all these people into it? And then at that time, to bring them all into it, a lot of pagan feasts were all then Christianized, and these people all then started to follow this new way. But they never went through that real conversion that happened with all the followers for the first 300 years. And then you start seeing those attitudes where they took on the moniker of Christian, and those people went on from there and just kept the same views. And eventually, because the Jewish people would not conform within that Roman world, then they were considered outsiders, and disdain was thrown towards them. And we see that all through European history, and really culminated in the Holocaust. And it wasn't really after the Holocaust that a lot of Christians, and specifically, I think within the Catholic and Lutheran framework, started saying, "My goodness, how did this get to this point?" When anybody who was learned in the Scriptures knew from Romans 9 through Romans 11 that Paul strictly said that all the blessings that God has promised the Jewish people are still in effect. All of them are. And he says, because God gave you mercy when you were unbelievers, so you, the Christians, are to give the Jewish people mercy. So we're to love them unconditionally, whether they believe in Jesus or not, because we are the adopted sons and only come into the faith of God only by the grace of God.
You want to make sure everyone understands as well, even though you call yourself an Italian Catholic, that you couldn't write a Jewish-sounding book without your good Jewish friend, Stephen Daskal.
That's absolutely correct.
So Stephen was kind of watched over your shoulder, so to speak.
Well, I'll tell you about my relationship with Steve. We were I was in a forum really speaking about Middle Eastern issues, and Steve was in there, and he came out that he was Jewish, but as we were talking about certain kind of things, eventually he led on that he was a traditional Jewish person who was kind of searching, because he was sharing in some of his opinions on Middle Eastern issues that he had problems with some of the declarations that the rabbis had said. So in doing that, he started searching, and his search took him in many different areas. So finally he came to the New Testament, and that was the last thing, because accepting Jesus was the worst thing that anybody who was Jewish could do. So he thought, well, look, I'll read this book, their book, and anyways, for an intellectual exercise, and just prove that this is false also. So he read it, and he says as he read it, he was absolutely hooked by the person of Jesus, especially the references to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because he was raised that Jesus was just a Gentile deity. And then there was, but the rabbis have said, you don't even go there. How Steve was raised basically told me, he says, if you picked up the New Testament, read it, you're already guilty of idolatry, because it was introducing his false God. So at his point, because he was kind of not in agreement with what the rabbis had been saying, and found a lot of things they were saying were burdensome to him, he decided, well, I'm going against the rabbis, I'm going to read this book. And through it, his faith walk then turned into a Messianic Jew. He saw the yoke that Jesus brought as much lighter than the rabbis, and he saw him fulfilling the Tanakh, the Old Testament scriptures, where the emphasis was placed on the written Torah, rather than the oral Torah, which the rabbis believe in. So he really came to that faith. Well, knowing that faith walk, when I got to know Steve and we started to talk, I told him that I had written this book and it was almost done. And from a Jewish perspective, could he make sure that I got all the Jewish stuff right? And that's where Steve's contribution to the book was wonderful, because if I wrote something that I thought was right and he says no to a Jewish audience, this wouldn't be correct, then Steve was the guy who tweaked all those things for me to make sure that it was absolutely accurate. And when Steve gave me the thumbs up, Joe, it's good to go, and then we went to publish it.
One of the controversial aspects of your book, you say, is that Jewish people can reconcile their faith to include Yeshua and remain Jewish.
Right, and this has been the contention from the beginning that, well, if Jewish people accept Yeshua, then automatically they have to fall into an Orthodox Christian, Catholic Christian, Protestant Christian thing. In other words, they have to leave where they are and join the Gentiles. Well, any Jewish person that would read the Old Testament, they're not seeing anywhere when you read all the books of Moses and the prophets that where does it say salvation? I have to leave the law and what the forefathers said and join the Gentiles. So this became really problematic. But as the Jewish people, then, a person is guided to please examine your own scriptures. Get into your own scriptures. And in your own scriptures, absolutely, it tells who the Messiah is. Who is the Messiah? You should be able to do that without the rabbinical interference. Read it for yourself and try to say, what is this picture of the Messiah being that's being drawn in the Old Testament, in the Tanakh? And in doing that, invariably, if they're free of that and look at it like that, it points to Yeshua. It points to no one else, especially in the reading of Isaiah 53. So, in doing that, then say, well, if I come into that faith, what else can I do? Well, the good news is there are many other Jews out there who have come to the same point of view, have maintained all the traditions of the Jewish people, and worship Jesus within a Jewish setting, and that's very important. So as a person like myself, raised Italian Catholic, I understand why Jewish people wouldn't want to get involved with that. It would be very foreign to them. Absolutely.
And religions, as you state, all religions do not lead to salvation.
No, they don't. No. And it's in this way, not to be closed-minded, but Christianity or following the Jewish Messiah is different, because this is the only faith, only one, where God himself becomes man. And God doesn't just become man because he feels like it. God specifically becomes man because this is the only way that sinful people who have faults, can be reconciled with an absolutely holy God. Above being loving, God is holy. And justice comes with that. So all of us humans who are tainted, there's nothing that we can do personally that can impress God. Nothing. Because our motivations, everything comes into suspect before a holy God. So the only way that we can truly be justified is God became man to do everything perfectly, and then not only that, allow himself to be terribly abused. In other words, go through things that we go through personally or even worse, and accept all that, bring all of that evil onto himself, so that when we accept what he's done for us, God lowering himself to be abused by us, when we accept that, then when the Lord himself looks upon us, he sees his Son. And in seeing his Son, it justifies us because all of our imperfections are no longer visible to him. We put on his Son and therefore can enter into his grace.
Why didn't the faith of the apostles and disciples die after the crucifixion?
Well, the only good explanation is that, in your question, it should have died. By all reason, it should have died. Jesus was publicly crucified. He was mutilated. He was ripped to shreds. So what reason can people come up with? Well, some people can say, well, there was this mass hysteria. You know, when Jesus was arrested, they all ran for the hills. The only one that showed up and in the crucifixion was well underway was John to accompany Mary, Jesus' mother. So he showed up. The rest of them really, so to speak, they almost went for the hills. So what happens is some event happened that changed their behavior. Wherefore they were more on fire for him than when they were actually with him before. Because a lot of things that he spoke about to them, they didn't get. They just didn't understand. But we know this. Let's talk about what we know instead of belief. Publicly crucified, because not only is it in the Gospels, it's also in other sources, Roman sources, or the Greek sources that verify he was crucified. We also know something else. We know for absolute certainty that the tomb was empty. We know that because there was no Jewish writings from that time that says we found the actual dead body of Jesus. There was no Romans who wrote about it that we hear what is the actual dead body. You show up with the dead body, the gig is up. It's over. So we know absolutely for sure that the Jewish people and the Romans never found that body. On top of that now, all of a sudden, we have this really boldness of these apostles who were with Jesus, but scattered when he was arrested and went through his passion, who are now emboldened. So they're emboldened. So the question then becomes, oh, Joe, they were just making it up. Well, you know what? Sometimes as human beings, I think we can lie if we can profit from lying. So if they all lied, let's say, what did they gain from their lying? They gained expulsion from their own community. They gained being beaten. And eventually, they all died terrible deaths. They gained nothing. The only one who probably died of natural causes was probably John when he was exiled. That's all. And he was a very old man. But the rest of them were terribly persecuted. So the only thing that sustains this, like it sustained Paul, was knowing for sure. It wasn't even faith in them. They know for sure that the Messiah rose from the dead, and he spent time with them, and they viewed his nail prints in his hands and his feet, and the spear, and his shredded torso from the scourging. That was what made them act that way, and being filled with the Holy Spirit, because now they were totally on board. So the Messiah, in God's own way, left it with these 12 people, and Paul was a big part of it too, and then these folks changed the world. It was only through that, knowing absolutely, that changed their life.
The title of the book, The Jewish People in Jesus. Is it time for reconciliation? You decide. And the author is Joseph Butta and Stephen Daskal. Joseph, tell us how to get your book.
Okay, well, what you can do, you can go to my blog, and my blog is at http:// Joe Butta, all one word, .wordpress.com. And then you can go to that blog, and then you can purchase the book right there, or you can go to any bookstore. If the bookstores don't carry it, you can just give them my name and the title of the book, and they'll order it for you. Or you can go right to the publisher, Authorhouse, and you can buy it straight from the publisher. So you have really 3 different ways to get the book.
Well, thanks for being on Author Talk, Joseph.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thanks for calling me. I really enjoyed this.